Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Validity Podcast. I'm your host, Valentina Rodriguez, and this is our third and final episode to our three-part protein intake recommendation series. So in the first part of this series, we talked about post-resistance training muscle protein synthetic research when it comes to protein intake. In the second episode, we talked about total protein daily intake. And in this episode, we're going to cover two more considerations and then consolidate everything and come up with my personal protein intake recommendation for maximizing both lean mass gains and favorable body composition results. As I stated in the last episode, I don't really have any personal updates because I'm filming all three parts on the same day. So all the updates that I gave in the first part of the series are the updates that apply to this episode, if that makes sense. So we're going to get pretty much straight into the science for this one. So again, first episode of this series, we covered the research when it comes to your muscle protein synthetic response to different doses of protein following a resistance training session. And what we found was that there was a dose-dependent response both in the amino acid delivery to skeletal muscle tissue and in the muscle protein synthesis rates. When you increase the amount of protein you consume post-workout, you increase the muscle protein synthetic response. And there appears to be no upper limit to that. Originally, the earlier studies were saying that at 20 grams, you maximize your muscle protein synthetic response. And if you consume 40 grams, there's no statistically significant difference between 40 and 20. Even though there was a greater increase seen, it wasn't statistically significant. Then a little bit of a more recent study found that 40 grams of protein actually did increase muscle protein synthesis greater than 20 grams of protein post-workout. And then we have the most recent study that found that 100 grams of protein actually increases it by 30% compared to 20 grams of protein. So we're starting to kind of dispel this myth that we have this like cap at around 20 to 25 grams of protein post-workout or anabolic upper limit. We're starting to dispel that myth. The second episode, we looked at different amounts of total daily protein intakes, and what we found was the current recommendations by these institutions range from 1.2 to 2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. And studies going above that actually found that you start to increase muscle mass gains if you go a little bit above that recommendation. And if you go a lot above that recommendation in the 3 to 4 grams per kilogram of body weight range, you don't actually see more lean muscle mass gains, but you do actually see greater decreases in fat mass. And that's while actually consuming more total daily calories because you're consuming more total daily protein. So there is still a favorable response to your body composition, even if it's not necessarily in the form of you getting more muscle mass gains by further increasing your total daily protein intake. One thing that we talked about in one of the episodes was that when you're considering your protein intake, the most important thing you need to consider is first your total daily protein intake. Then you consider how you distribute that total daily protein intake. And then you focus on specifically each meal and your post-workout meal specifically. So there's kind of like a hierarchical structure. And we talked about the muscle protein synthesis response to specifically post-resistance training protein intake. We talked about the total daily protein intake as a whole. And now we're going to look at two more studies, two more things to consider before we can kind of put it all together. And this is kind of taking it one step further beyond just how much protein should you be consuming in a day. It's how many times should protein be consumed in a day. So how should you divide your total daily protein intake? And what we need to kind of first establish is that you consume protein. We talked about this in the first episode. You consume protein. Some of that protein, it all gets broken down into amino acids. Some of those amino acids actually get sequestered by your GI tract. The rest of it goes into your bloodstream, and some of that ends up in your muscle tissue and in your muscle cells, and that's what can go and contribute to increases in muscle protein synthesis. So you consume protein, there's an increase in your blood or your plasma amino acid levels, and this increase in plasma amino acid levels is associated with an increase in muscle protein synthesis. But there's a theoretical refractory response of skeletal muscle tissue. It's also called the muscle full effect. And this is where rates of muscle protein synthesis will not elevate further despite elevations in amino acids. And it's almost like they need to reset. There's like a refractory period where you can't just continuously increase your plasma amino acid levels and expect your muscle protein synthesis to just indefinitely increase. It almost needs to like reset. And this is what's called the refractory period. This is all, again, theoretical. But we do know that you can't just indefinitely increase your plasma amino acid levels. If so, I would just have amino acids like on an IV drip and have my muscle protein synthesis like fucking running nonstop, you know, but that's not the case. So the study that kind of helped elucidate this theoretical refractory response is called Latency and Duration of Stimulation of Human Muscle Protein Synthesis During Continuous Infusion of Amino Acids. It's by Bo et al. It was published in 2001, so pretty earlier foundational study. And what they did was they gave the subjects 6 hours of constant amino acid infusions via an IV. And what they found was that in the first 2 hours, there was a significant increase in mixed muscle protein synthesis rates, which we know includes sarcoplasmic, mitochondrial, and myofibrillar. And if you don't know what those are, go back to episode 1 of this series specifically, part 1, I guess, of this series specifically. And they found a significant increase in specifically myofibrillar muscle protein synthesis. So this is specifically the muscle protein synthesis that is associated with an increase in the actual contractile proteins in your skeletal muscle tissue. So that's within the first 2 hours. Remember, they were being given this IV for 6 straight hours. From hours 2 to hours 6, so in the latter 4 hours, mixed muscle protein synthesis and myofibrillar muscle protein synthesis rates came back down to baseline despite the infusion of amino acids still constantly running during those hours 2 to 6. So what the authors concluded is that there's an upper limit to the amount of protein you can consume over a period of time and its ability to maximally stimulate muscle protein synthesis. This happens when the rates of muscle protein synthesis do not elevate further despite amino acid elevations. And it's said that this is when skeletal muscle becomes refractory. And in order to get another spike, theoretically, we think that plasma amino acid levels need to kind of reset. They need to come back down to resensitize skeletal muscle. We don't know exactly what is needed to resensitize. We talked about this further, and I think Dr. Campbell ended up kind of amending this statement a little bit, saying it's not necessarily that plasma amino acid levels need to come back to baseline. Sometimes it's just like time specifically needed. We don't know. I can't say for certain, but point is you can't just indefinitely increase muscle protein synthesis. So that's one thing we need to consider. And so that brings up the question, is there an ideal protein feeding distribution throughout the day to maximize muscle mass? So if we can't just consistently, constantly increase our plasma amino acid levels via just, constantly eating protein. I mean, if we could, I'd just be chugging shakes all day. If that's not the case, then how often should we be eating? How should we be distributing our protein to ensure that we're allowing that resensitization to happen, but not allowing it to happen and then come back to baseline and then we're missing out on our ability to respike it? Like, how should we be distributing our protein to maximize our ability to increase muscle protein synthesis and therefore increase our muscle mass? And so this brings us to the last study we're going to cover before we kind of consolidate everything together. And this is called Evenly Distributed Protein Intake Over 3 Meals Augments Resistance Exercise-Induced Muscle Hypertrophy in Healthy Young Men. It was by Yasuda et al. And it was published in 2020. So again, more recent. And they had 26 untrained males. So here's a caveat. It is untrained. That's one thing that we just have to kind of note. And what they did was they were randomized to either a high protein breakfast where they were given a protein shake with breakfast or a low protein breakfast where their protein shake was given with dinner. And the biggest thing to note here is that a traditional Western diet backloads the protein. So a traditional Western diet has a low protein breakfast, a medium protein lunch, and a high protein dinner. And so this high protein breakfast group, the way that their protein was set up throughout the day, having that protein shake with their breakfast instead of with dinner like the other group did, it allowed for their protein to be more evenly distributed throughout the day. So the high protein breakfast group ended up having similar amounts of protein in their breakfast, in their lunch, and in their dinner, whereas the low protein breakfast group had a low protein breakfast. Their lunch was moderate, and their dinner was very, very high protein. So it was the same protein intake throughout the day, but the high protein breakfast group had it evenly distributed between 3 meals by essentially having a little bit more in their breakfast. And then the low protein breakfast group had essentially like backloaded their protein intake and had the majority of their protein intake in their final feeding with dinner. They were resistance training, so they were training 3 times a week for 12 weeks. They had 3 upper body exercises and 2 lower body exercises, and everything was 2 sets of 10 plus 1 set of as many reps as possible to failure. And what they found, first and foremost, when it comes to the overall nutritional data they collected, was that everyone followed their protein prescription. So if you were in the high protein breakfast group, that group followed it well. The low protein breakfast group followed that well, etc. There was no significant difference in total daily calories. So they were eating about the same. The low protein breakfast group was eating around 97 grams of total protein a day. They had 8 grams of protein during breakfast, 30 grams of protein during lunch, and 55 grams of protein during dinner. So like I said, this low protein breakfast group kind of had a backloaded protein distribution. The high protein breakfast group ate around 90 grams of protein total per day. And they had 22 grams of protein during breakfast because they had that added shake in there, 32 grams of protein during lunch, and 32 grams of protein during dinner. So it was way more evenly distributed. Again, it was 22 breakfast, 32 grams lunch, 32 grams dinner, versus the other group, the low protein breakfast group, had only 8 grams of protein in the breakfast, 30 for lunch, and 55 for dinner. So way less evenly distributed throughout the day. And what they found when it comes to nutritional data, the only significant difference between the groups when it comes to how much protein they ate in the day, calories, etc., the only significant difference between these two groups was the amount of protein at breakfast and at dinner. That was statistically significantly different between the groups. Both groups significantly increased their lean body mass, but the high protein breakfast group, so the one with more evenly distributed protein intake throughout their day, gained 5.5 pounds of lean body mass over the span of these 12 weeks, whereas the low protein group only gained 3.9 pounds of lean body mass. This difference was actually not statistically significant. The p-value was 0.056, and if you know anything about statistics, for something to be statistically significant, it has to be 0.05 or below, and this was a p-value of 0.056. So it was kind of right on the cusp. And again, it's not up to us to determine whether that's statistically significant or not, because we just have to abide by general scientific guidelines, and that is not statistically significant. But if we're talking about practical significance and we're talking about our own interpretation of this and the author's interpretation of it, when the authors calculated the effect size favored the high protein breakfast group. So the effect size favored the group that had more evenly distributed protein throughout the day. And again, it wasn't statistically significant, but I would take a 5.5 pound average lean mass increase over 12 weeks over a 3.9 pound average lean mass increase over 12 weeks. So what the author said was that more evenly distributed protein intake was superior to a skewed protein intake distribution. And our biggest takeaway from this study is just that evenly distributing your protein intake seems to increase your lean muscle mass better than or greater than this skewed or backloaded kind of protein distribution paradigm. So that's the final study that we are covering today. And now it's time to kind of consolidate everything from the past 2 episodes and everything we've talked about in this episode and come up with a recommendation. Because like I mentioned, everything I've talked about in the past 2 episodes is pretty analogous to how it was lectured by Dr. Campbell. But the final assignment that we had in the sports nutrition course that Dr. Campbell taught was to create our own recommendation based on all the studies that we covered, our own recommendation of protein intake for increasing lean muscle mass. And everyone had a different recommendation because, like I've said in every single episode of this series so far, there is no consensus. There's no consensus across institutions, across research, across anything. And so I am about to present my personal take, which Dr. Campbell kind of gave the green light on based on my reasoning. So I feel very confident in sharing it with you guys. And I mean, we've literally gone through all the data to support it. So as we know, protein as a macronutrient plays a critical role in optimizing the strength and hypertrophy related adaptations to resistance training. Like I said a gajillion and 1 times before, while there's currently a consensus on the general recommendation of a daily protein intake, an RDA of 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight, this RDA is for generally healthy men and women, and it does not apply to resistance trained individuals, and is therefore, this RDA of 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight is not high enough to offset the oxidation of amino acids during exercise, to provide adequate substrate for lean body mass gain, or to repair exercise-induced damage to muscle fibers. Therefore, obviously, we have these different institutions that have put forth their own specific protein intake recommendations. These recommendations specifically for resistance-trained individuals range from 1.4 to 2 grams per per kilogram of body weight. And these are from the NSCA, ACSM, ISSN, etc. The problem with these recommendations is that, one, they vary from institution to institution. So like I said, there's just no consensus. And two, I've also mentioned this in past episodes, they overlook the updated body of protein research. They use a lot of outdated studies and they just don't consider everything from the muscle protein synthetic data to the body composition data to the applied data, all of the above. So when we consider the entire body of cellular and applied research on the effects of various protein intakes on the body composition and muscle protein synthetic response of resistance trained individuals, to me, it becomes evident that the recommendation should actually be between 2.3 grams and 3.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day, evenly distributed between 5 to 6 meals, spaced approximately 3 hours apart. So that is my recommendation. I'm about to get into the reasoning, but I'm just going to repeat that. My recommendation for a protein intake recommendation in order to maximize lean muscle mass gain and favorable body composition results is that you should be consuming between 2.3 and 3.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. That intake should be evenly distributed between 5 to 6 meals, and it should be spaced approximately 3 hours apart. Now let's get into my reasoning. Firstly, when it comes to just the general total daily protein intake, the recommendation I'm making is 2.3 to 3.4 grams per kg of body weight per day. The reason that I gave this recommendation that's higher than the current 1.4 to 2 gram recommendation across institutions is the study that we covered by Dr. Campbell, where they found that the daily intake of 2.4 grams per kilogram was significantly superior for lean mass gains as compared to 0.9 grams per kilogram. A study by Mettler et al. Showed that a daily protein intake of 2.3 grams per kg was superior to 1.6 grams per kg in preserving lean body mass during a dieting phase, which I think is an important caveat to have in your recommendation because a lot of resistance training individuals undergo dieting phases. So I don't just want to give a recommendation that's going to serve you if you're not dieting, because most times when you're dieting, you don't drop your protein, you don't increase your protein. Protein typically stays standard when you're dieting, and you just drop your calories and therefore you drop your carbs and your fats accordingly. So I want to give a recommendation that's going to be high enough for you to have the benefits that you want to be seeing also in a dieting phase. And there was a study by Mettler et al., like I just said, that showed that if you want to preserve lean muscle mass during a dieting phase, 2.3 grams per kilogram of body weight is superior to 1.6 grams. And 1.6 sits within that range of recommendations that the institutions put out. So already this study by Mettler increases that recommendation, if that makes sense. So when we're looking at even higher, I mean, I have a range. I have 2.3 to 3.4. So when we're looking at those even higher daily protein intakes, we talked about the studies by Antonio et al. There were 2 of them. And what they reported was that there was significantly greater fat mass lost in individuals consuming 3.4 grams per kilogram of body weight of protein compared to individuals consuming 2.3. So the 2.3 is better than the 1.6, but the 3.4 is better than the 2.3 in losing fat mass without dropping calories. And you should go back to the second episode of this series if you want more information on that, because I talked about exactly what happened in those studies in that episode. So again, in this specific study, the higher protein group did not gain more lean mass, but they decreased their fat mass even while significantly increasing their total daily caloric intake by about 400 calories. So this 3.4 grams per kilogram of body weight dose is not necessarily better for increasing your lean mass, but in the study, it showed that the subjects consuming this lost body fat while actually increasing their total daily intake by around 400 calories. So to me, this suggests that greater protein intake of around 3.4 grams per kg had positive effects on body composition that was not seen in the group consuming 2.3. So to me, 3.4 is better for overall body composition than 2.3, but 2.3 is better for lean mass gain than 1.6. I know that sounds like a tongue twister, but just work with me here. So collectively, these studies suggest that a total daily protein intake of around 2.3 to 3.4 grams of protein per kg of body weight are superior to the current recommendations of around 1.4 to 2 grams per kg in improving body composition as a whole, not in specifically increasing muscle mass, not in specifically decreasing fat mass, in as a whole improving your body composition. Beyond daily protein intakes, I give you recommendations as to how to actually distribute that and whatnot. So beyond this daily protein intake of 2.3 to 3.4 grams per kg of body weight, resistance training athletes can further optimize their body composition and muscle protein synthetic response to resistance training by manipulating the distribution of this total daily protein intake. First, I think it's important to consider the number of meals to divide that protein between. The current average daily meal frequency of American adults is 3.47 meals per day, according to this massive survey. Everything is linked in the references below. According to this massive survey of thousands of data, the average American adult consumes 3.47 meals per day, okay? However, there was a study that showed that increasing meal frequency increases lean body mass, anaerobic power, and fat loss, and that specifically 6 meals per day are superior to 2 meals per day for preserving lean body mass while in a deficit. So in my recommendation, I'm not just looking at increasing muscle mass or decreasing fat mass. I'm also looking at what is a good protein intake that not only does those two things, but will also preserve your lean mass if you start dieting, but you maintain that protein intake. I hope that makes sense. So given that the average American adult consumes 3.47 meals per day, given that if you increase your meal frequency, you increase lean body mass, anaerobic power, and fat loss, and that 6 meals is superior to 2 for preserving lean body mass while in a deficit, my recommendation is that you should be consuming 5 to 6 meals per day, because that would be increasing from the current American adult average. Consume 5 to 6 meals per day instead of the current 3 to 4 average. And within these meals, evenly distribute the total daily protein intake as they did in that study by Yasuda et al., where the evenly distributed protein group saw greater increases in lean body mass and more favorable body composition results and more favorable body composition outcomes. So to me, evenly distributing protein intake throughout the day augments the hypertrophic response to resistance training. Increasing your meal frequency increases your lean body mass, anaerobic power, and fat loss. 5 to 6 meals is superior to 2 to 4 when it comes to preserving lean body mass on a deficit. So collectively, you have your daily protein intake of 2.3 to 3.4 grams per kg of body weight per day. Within that total daily protein intake, divide that into 5 to 6 meals and make sure that that protein intake is evenly divided between those 5 to 6 meals per day. The last recommendation I make is regarding the protein content and timing of those 5 to 6 meals. So there was a study by Areta et al., and it demonstrated that 20 grams of protein every 3 hours resulted in significantly greater muscle protein synthesis rates after resistance training when compared to 10 grams of protein every 1.5 hours or 40 grams of protein every 6 hours. So this specific study looked at different amounts of protein spread out across different amounts of time. So one group did 20 grams of protein every 3 hours. Another group did 10 grams of protein every 1.5 hours, and another group did 40 grams of protein every 6 hours. And the group with the greatest muscle protein synthetic response was the one that was consuming 20 grams of protein every 3 hours. So I recommended that within your total daily protein intake, divide that evenly between 5 to 6 meals, but ensure that your meals have at least 20 grams of protein and that they are around 3 hours apart. The biggest exception when it comes to this specific recommendation is your post-workout meal. And this is where all the research from the first episode of this series is going to come into play. When it comes to your post-workout meal, your post-resistance training meal, athletes should consume at least 40 grams of protein after resistance training, because it's been shown to be superior to 20 grams of protein, both statistically significantly and non-statistically significantly across 4 studies now that we covered in the first part of the series. And consuming 40 grams of protein after resistance training is superior to 20 grams of protein after resistance training in increasing post-exercise muscle protein synthesis rates. So, in conclusion, if we are consolidating my recommendation that encompasses all the studies that we covered, plus additional studies that I looked into in order to best formulate this recommendation, in order to optimize both body composition and the adaptations to resistance training, while in a maintenance, in a growing phase, or in a deficit, athletes, resistance training individuals, bodybuilders, you, me, whoever is interested in this, should consume between 2.3 to 3.4 grams of protein per kg of body weight, split evenly between 5 to 6 meals containing at least 20 grams of protein spaced around 3 hours apart, with a post-resistance training protein bout of at least 40 grams of protein. So let's break that down one more time. First, you start with your total daily protein intake, which should be around 2.3 to 3.4 grams of protein per kg of body weight. You find what that is. Let's give an example. For me, if I'm going at the upper threshold, let's do 3.4 grams for me. And I'm itty bitty right now on prep. So let's make sure that we're keeping that in mind. That for me is around 156 grams of protein per day. Let's say I eat 5 meals. I do eat 5 meals a day. So I'm going to take my 156 grams of total daily protein and I would divide it between 5 meals. But first, I'm going to consider that my post-workout meal should have at least 40 grams of protein in it. So I'm going to take that 156. I'm going to subtract my post-workout meal. So I'm going to subtract 40 grams of protein. That leaves me with 116 grams of protein to spread out over my remaining 4 meals, because my post-workout meal is one of my 5 meals, right? So now I have 4 meals left. So after I account for my post-workout meal, I have my 156 grams of total daily protein. 40 of those is going towards my post-workout meal. It leaves me with 116. I divide that between 4 meals, and that gives me 4 meals of about 30 grams of protein each. And so I'm going to time it to where those meals are about 3 hours apart. So I might have my first meal at 9:30, breakfast, with 30 grams of protein in it. Around 12:30, I'll have my pre-workout meal with 30 grams of protein in it. Then I'll lift, and around 3:30 p.m., 3 hours later, I'll have my post-workout meal with 40 grams of protein in it, because that's the recommendation for maximizing your muscle protein synthetic response to resistance training. 3 hours later at 6:30, I'll have my penultimate meal, my 4th meal of the day, with 30 grams of protein in it. And then at around 9:30, I'll have my last meal of the day with 30 grams of protein in it. And you already know it's going to be my sugar cookie protein oats, because I'm obsessed with those. Shameless plug, code Val, because it's the most delicious thing on this planet. I do not plug things on my podcast, but oh my God, if you haven't seen my obsession with my sugar cookie protein oats on my Instagram story, I recommend. I have a whole story highlight, because my inbox and my DMs is literally flooded with the recipe, and all it is just sugar cookie protein, cinnamon, stevia, and oatmeal. But it's delicious, and almond butter on top. But anyways, I digress. That would be what this specific recommendation that I'm giving would look like. So again, I start out with 3.4 grams of protein, which is the upper threshold of my 2.3 to 3.4 grams of protein per kg of body weight. That to me is around 156 grams per day. I account 40 of those as going towards my post-workout meal, which leaves me with 116 to evenly distribute across my remaining 4 meals. So then breakfast will have 30 grams of protein in it. Pre-workout meal will have 30 grams of protein in it. Post-workout meal will have 40 grams of protein in it. Then my 4th meal of the day will have 30 grams of protein in it. And my last meal of the day will have 30 grams of protein in it. And altogether, this abides by and fulfills what I think should be the current recommendation for protein intake recommendations for maximizing muscle mass gain and improving your body composition when it comes to resistance training individuals. Mic drop. I'm just kidding. But seriously, I think the current recommendations are A, far too low, and B, they overlook so much of the data that's telling us that we should be pushing protein intake a little bit higher to see even more favorable body composition results. And the coolest thing, in my opinion, is that the favorable body composition outcomes that you get from increasing your muscle, from increasing your protein intake, such as like a decrease in fat mass, which we see in many studies, not just one, not just two, we see it across multiple studies. That is not at the expense of dieting. Like, you're getting this decrease in fat mass while actually eating more. In one of the studies, the high protein group consumed 400 more calories. In another study, the high protein group increased their intake by 800 calories and they lost fat mass. If you haven't listened to the second episode, the second part of the series, I really recommend you go back and listen to that, because that's where these outcomes were elucidated and that's where we discussed them. But all in all, I'm going to say one more time, just to beat a dead horse, like Dr. Campbell loves beating dead horses. I guess, student becomes the master. I'll beat a dead horse too. My recommendation to optimize body composition and the adaptations to resistance training for resistance training individuals is that they should consume between 2.3 to 3.4 grams of protein per kg of body weight per day, split evenly between 5 to 6 meals containing at least 20 grams of protein, spaced around 3 hours apart, with specifically a post-resistance training protein bout or a post-workout meal containing at least 40 grams of protein. The reason why I give a range for your total daily meals. So why I say it should be split between 5 to 6 meals is because if you're a smaller individual and your total daily protein intake is just not that high because your body weight is not that high, if you split it between 6 meals and those meals drop below 20 grams of protein, it's more beneficial for you to do 5 meals a day and get a little bit more protein per meal than for you to split it between 6 meals per day and have less than 20 grams of protein per meal. So you do want to ensure that your meals contain at least 20 grams of protein. That's part of the recommendation. So if they don't, then do less meals, but make sure those meals are around 3 hours apart. Make sure your post-workout meal has 40 grams of protein, and make sure your total daily protein intake is within 2.3 to 3.4 grams of protein per kg of body weight. Now that's the last time I'm going to say that. So with that, I hope you guys enjoyed. I think this little series is really relevant and applicable and honestly like really important, but also really overlooked because we don't have like a set recommendation that we can really put out. And I wanted to put one out there because there just isn't one. And this is mine. So this is the Valentina Rodriguez protein recommendation for resistance training individuals to optimize body composition and the adaptations to resistance training. Slay. Okay. So with that, I'm going to shut up. As always, if you have any questions, call me, beat me if you want to reach me, aka DM me or email me so I can get back to you ASAP. If you do want to be a subject in the world's first reverse dieting study, email reversedietstudy@gmail.com and be patient because we have a really high volume of inquiries, but we do get back to everybody in due time. And if you want to follow along prep, protein oatmeal recipes, anything, all of that is on my Instagram and on my YouTube. I'm about to film a little show day recap video for YouTube, so that should be up soon as well. Well, by the time this episode is out, it will be up. So go check that out. And otherwise, I hope you guys have an amazing day. I hope you guys eat lots of protein, follow these recommendations. Let me know your thoughts, comments, and concerns, and I will see you in the next episode.